Hi, everyone. We're going to give it a few minutes and then we're going to get started. We're just waiting for more people to join, and then we should get started soon. Thank you. Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm Jasmine Tapale. I'm the Senior Program Manager at the Community Planning and Engagement Team at the New York City Department of City Planning, and we're excited to be here with you tonight. Before we get started, we want to share some housekeeping information for those that need interpretation and access to dial-in options. So for anyone who needs interpretation, please click on the interpretation icon for Spanish, Mandarin, or Cantonese to hear simultaneous interpretation of the session. Spanish, Mandarin, or Cantonese speaking participants may also contact us for additional assistance via email at dcp cityofyes _ dl@planning.nyc.gov. We'll have the Spanish interpreter share this information in Spanish, so if the Spanish interpreter can come off mute.
One moment, I'll bring them out of the channel.
And sorry, everyone, if you can just give us a moment while we just
Sure.
get our translators in place.
Uh, Aziel, could you read the second paragraph, please?
Si por favor haga clic en el símbolo de interpretación en español, mandarín o cantonés para escuchar la interpretación simultánea de la sesión. También nos puede contactar para asistencia adicional por el correo dcp@planning.nyc.gov. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And then next, if we can have our Mandarin interpreter share that information as well.
Edward, could you read the um, translation in Mandarin, please?
I am reading. Hello?
Yes, could you do it on the main channel? You're in the main channel now.
Hello? Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear
Okay.
you.
OK，今天晚上呢，我们是有华语、西班牙语、粤语的同声翻译。如果大家想要收听翻译的话呢，请点选这个屏幕下方有个地球一样的按钮。在提问环节呢，我们也有普通话、粤语的翻译的帮助的。如果你需要更多帮助的话呢，那参与者也可以通过电子邮件的方式 DCP City of Yes 底线 dl@planning.nyc.gov 与我们取得联系。谢谢 ，Thank you。
Thank you very much. And then lastly, our Cantonese, please.
請點擊同聲傳譯嘅圖標，收會以呢個西班牙語、國語、粵語嘅同聲傳譯。如果個係有任何嘅問題，可以用國語或者粵語翻譯嚟幫助。如果想要更多嘅幫助咧，講西班牙語、國語或者粵語參加者係可以透過電郵嘅方式。DCP City of Yes 底線 DL@planning.nyc.gov 與我哋取得聯絡。Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for your patience.
We're just experiencing a moment of technical difficulty.
Sure.
We'll be able to resume momentarily. One moment, please. Interpreters, you should be in your functioning channels again. Thank you so much. Sorry for the inconvenience. We can proceed.
Thank you for everyone's patience. We'll get started. So going to the next slide. So in January, we kicked off our City of Yes for Housing Opportunity info session series. Tonight is the second in that series on diverse housing types. Next month, we'll focus on the missing middle, and in April, we'll come back together to talk about the entire proposal. But for tonight's agenda, we'll start off with a presentation to share information on the proposal, and then the team will talk more. The team will talk more about this, but I just want to stress that the proposal and the zoning text is still being drafted. But we created the series to be able to share as much information as we can early on, and then answer as many questions as we can. So during the presentation, you could submit written Q&A using the Q&A feature. Then during the live Q&A part, you'll have the option to raise your hand and to ask questions live. If you're on the phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand. We'll take questions in the order that they come in, and we'll go back and forth between live and written questions. Next slide. If you wish to participate through the phone, you have a few numbers that you can call. There's the toll-free numbers. The first is 877-853-5247 or 888-788-0099. The toll numbers include 212-338-8477 or 253-215-8792. When prompted, you can enter the meeting ID, which is 864-6760-2082, and then you hit the participant ID, which is pound, and then the password is going to be 495865. If you have any questions after this session, feel free to email us at the housingopportunity@planning.nyc.gov email. You can also go to our website, City of Yes for Housing Opportunity, where you can sign up to our newsletter, and we'll continue to share updates there as we get closer to the public referral period. Next slide. So now I want to pass it on to Veronica Brown, who's part of our housing division, and she will start the presentation.
Great, thanks so much. We can go ahead and move to the next slide. So good evening. We're excited for you to hear about City of Yes for Housing Opportunity, a citywide text amendment that will change zoning to allow for equitable housing development. This text amendment will enable the creation of a little more housing in every neighborhood by removing the layers of exclusionary zoning that have created barriers to housing growth. This proposal will update our zoning to better meet the needs of today's New Yorkers. If each neighborhood, from the highest density to the lowest density areas, adds a little more housing, New York City can add a lot more housing overall without any single neighborhood experiencing dramatic changes or overtaxed infrastructure. Next slide, please. New York City has seen tremendous job growth over the past 20 years, but housing production simply hasn't kept pace with the city's growing population. The little housing growth that has happened, particularly new affordable housing, has been concentrated in relatively few neighborhoods. This has all led us to a city with historically low vacancy rate of 1.4%. That lack of housing choice is felt every day by New Yorkers. In a tight housing market, landlords can charge high rents, and existing tenants are vulnerable to tenant harassment, poor housing quality, and displacement pressures. Not having enough homes is also the direct cause of homelessness. Changing our zoning can respond to these issues by increasing the number and the types of homes available for a range of incomes in every neighborhood across the city. A little more housing in every neighborhood can have other big picture benefits for New York, including bolstering the local economy and supporting our environmental goals. This complements the other two City of Yes text amendments, City of Yes for Economic Opportunity and City of Yes for Carbon Neutrality. Next slide, please. This text amendment is the biggest pro-housing change that DCP has ever undertaken, and we'll be touching the zoning for every single part of the city. Some of our biggest moves include the Universal Affordability Preference, UAP, which will allow bigger buildings for affordable and supportive housing in every medium and high-density zoning district. We also propose eliminating residential parking mandates citywide, removing the conflict between housing and parking. We're also enabling more missing middle housing or low-rise apartment buildings in our low-density areas. We'll do this through town center zoning and commercial corridors and transit-oriented development in highly accessible areas. We also aim to help homeowners in our low-density neighborhoods by creating an accessory dwelling unit or ADU program and providing small buildings with additional flexibility to adapt over time. There's also a range of smaller proposals that will enable a few important housing options that can help bring New Yorkers the housing they need. These proposals include enabling the conversion of non-residential buildings, allowing small and shared apartments in central locations, and allowing for residential campuses to add height-limited buildings if they choose. Next slide, please. So our current restrictive zoning results in not enough homes for New Yorkers. It also means that many housing types that have historically served our city are impossible to build today. Tonight, we're going to walk through the details of a few different proposals that can help to provide a range of housing types to meet New Yorkers' diverse needs. So first, we'll talk about accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, which are small homes located on the same lot as a one or two family building. Next, we'll cover a proposal to allow more buildings with studios and one bedrooms, as well as homes that share common spaces like kitchens. Finally, we'll share a proposal to allow for the conversion of underused non-residential buildings, including vacant offices or former schools, into much-needed homes. Next slide, please. So now I'll walk through a few slides about ADUs. Under this proposal, one or two family homes will be allowed to add a small accessory dwelling unit, known as an ADU. There are several types of ADUs, many of which already exist in our low-density areas from before our current restrictive zoning was put into place. These may include attached in-law suites or granny flats, separate backyard homes, including for the conversion of a detached garage, or an attic or basement unit. The same rule changes that would enable ADUs can also help homeowners who don't want to add an ADU, but they just need some additional flexibility to meet their family's needs. Because most buildings were built before our current restrictive zoning, most buildings in low-density areas are out of compliance, meaning that they're not in line with today's zoning rules. This makes it very difficult for homeowners to make simple alterations, even if that doesn't involve adding another home to their property. On a given block in a low-density area, some homeowners may choose to add an ADU, others might choose to make a small renovation to their home, and many will undoubtedly choose to keep their home the way it is today. Next slide, please. Many other cities and states have already implemented ADU programs. Their successes can show us that these units have big benefits for working families. multi-generational families who need a little more space, or middle-class homeowners who could benefit from additional income for their household expenses. These small units will provide important housing options for small households, like a young person moving into their own place for the first time, or an elderly resident who wants to age in place. The current lack of housing choices forces these New Yorkers to move away when they'd rather stay in the neighborhood. Because of their small size, ADUs also serve different income levels than a large single-family home does. Not only will ADUs be more naturally affordable than other housing types, they'll also introduce a rental opportunity for voucher holders in our low-density areas. Today, many New Yorkers who receive rental subsidies can't find a place to use them, demonstrating the need for more housing options throughout the city. Next slide, please. In order to enable ADUs, we'll make a series of changes to the zoning. One ADU will be allowed per 1 or 2 family building in any zoning district. That ADU will be limited to 800 square feet. The zoning rules will be sufficiently flexible to enable a range of types of ADUs: detached, attached, attic, or basement. Owners can decide for themselves if they want to add an ADU and what type may work best for their home. For example, we anticipate the detached styles will only be feasible on large lots that can accommodate emergency access to the rear. ADUs will be required to be 5 feet from the lot line and 10 feet from any other building. Detached ADUs will also be allowed to be 2 stories, which can accommodate an over-the-garage living space. The zoning will also have special rules that grant additional flexibility to existing buildings that are converting into ADUs. For example, if someone wants to take an existing detached garage and convert that into an ADU, they'll be allowed to do so, even if that puts them above the floor area limit in their zoning district. They will not, however, be able to create a completely new space that exceeds that limit. Beyond zoning, ADUs will also have to comply with other rules, such as the building code and the housing maintenance code, which help to ensure the safety and quality of our living spaces. Next slide, please. On New York City's small lots, there are significant opportunities for basement ADUs, but these homes also face particular challenges and therefore will be subject to some additional regulations. Consistent with other rules for subgrade space, new basement ADUs will not be allowed in the coastal floodplain. No ADUs of any type will be allowed in special coastal risk districts, areas of our city with the most severe flood risks, such as Broad Channel or Hamilton Beach. Outside of these coastal areas, basement ADUs may be subject to additional regulations or review. Recent weather events have tragically demonstrated that some inland areas of the city are susceptible to stormwater flooding. These rules, which are still in development, will help to ensure that future basement units are safe for tenants. We know there are already many existing unregulated basement apartments in New York. Bringing these units out of the shadows is critical for their occupant safety, but will require changes to state and local laws beyond zoning. The Adams administration will do what it can to enable the safe legalization of these units. Now I'll pass it off to my colleague, Winnie Shen, to continue the presentation.
Thanks, Veronica. So moving on to our next proposal, allowing more small and shared apartments. What this means is allowing buildings with only simple, no-frills studios, as well as homes with private bedrooms, but shared kitchens or other common facilities. These building types have historically played an important role in New York's housing landscape, especially for young working New Yorkers who need a place to stay while they get their feet under them. Although these buildings provide critical housing, they were banned in the 20th century, largely because of prejudice and exclusion. New small and shared apartments can once again provide these important housing choices for New Yorkers, especially marginally housed New Yorkers, and people who prefer to live alone but can't afford to do so. Today, we're forcing many people into living situations they don't want. In some cases, that's a shelter or doubling up in an overcrowded unit. But our lack of housing options is also what forces young professionals to team up with roommates and take up family-size units. Allowing for more small and shared apartments could ease the pressure on these large family-size units. Next slide, please. Allowing buildings with more small apartments would involve changes to the dwelling unit factor, or a measure of the minimum average unit size in a building. The zoning rule requires buildings to have a mix of big and small units if they want to max out their space. The dwelling unit factor is outdated and redundant with other codes that do a better job regulating the minimum unit size. Under this proposal, the dwelling unit factor would be removed in the areas of the city with the best proximity to transit, what's known as the transit zone and is shown on this map in the darker green color. buildings would still be subject to rules like the Housing Maintenance Code and the Building Code, which do set minimum sizes for livable rooms and require windows and other measures for safety and livability. Income-restricted housing would still be subject to existing HPD rules about bedroom mixes. Outside the central area, the zoning regulations will be reduced and simplified so that all multifamily buildings have a dwelling unit factor of 500. Currently, arbitrary dwelling unit factors vary by district. Together, these changes can re-legalize an important housing type while easing pressure on family size units. Next slide, please. This proposal would also develop clear rules for building shared housing, or homes with private bedrooms, but shared kitchens and other common facilities. Our current zoning does not have a clear path for building shared housing. Creating clear definitions and rules would make this process less complex and enable a fuller range of shared housing options. These rules would make it possible to build shared housing in any multifamily zoning district. And this will enable the development of new construction shared housing, including affordable shared housing. These clear rules can also help to re-legalize existing unregulated shared housing. Other cities like Seattle and San Diego have already re-legalized this kind of housing and found that it meets a need in their housing markets. New York City can learn from these examples, as well as the city's own history, to see the importance of re-legalizing small and shared options. Next slide, please. In the early 20th century, countless young New Yorkers lived in buildings like the Barbizon, where they could rent reasonably priced rooms or small apartments. The 1961 zoning resolution made new developments like this illegal. Today, a young New Yorker looking for their first job and their first apartment would be hard-pressed to find a simple small home in a central location that they could rent on their own. Instead, they might have to find roommates in order to afford rent and take up a family-size unit elsewhere in the city. Re-legalizing small or shared apartments in central locations can bring back a once popular housing type in central locations and create more housing opportunities for New Yorkers at all stages of their lives. Next slide, please. Our next proposal is to make it easier to convert underused non-residential buildings, including vacant offices. Zoning already has rules that make it easier to convert non-residential buildings into housing. But these rules have relatively limited applicability. Buildings generally have to be located in New York's densest commercial centers and be built before 1961 to qualify. Through this proposal, we'll extend those existing rules to more parts of the city and to more buildings. And this will help create urgently needed homes in highly accessible locations and will also breathe new life into underused buildings. Next slide, please. Extending our existing adaptive reuse regulations involves a few discrete changes to our zoning. First, we'll change the eligible geography from only office centers in Lower Manhattan and limited areas in Queens and Brooklyn to the entire city. And this will allow for the conversion of buildings beyond just large offices, like schools or former religious buildings. Second, we'll allow more recent buildings to have access to our adaptive reuse regulations. Today, a building has to be built prior to 1961 or 1977, depending on what part of the city it's in, to use the more flexible conversion rules. We'll move this cutoff date to a uniform 1990, allowing underused buildings from the 70s and 80s to convert to housing. Finally, our current adaptive reuse regulations only apply when a non-residential building is converting into traditional apartments. But offices' floor plates, for example, may work better for other kinds of housing, like shared housing or dormitories. So we'll change our adaptive reuse regulations so that it can be used to convert into any type of housing, including supportive housing, shared housing, or dorms. Next slide, please. We can look to the parts of the city that already have access to our more flexible adaptive reuse regulations to see how New Yorkers can benefit from conversions. At 180 Water Street in the Financial District, a 1971 office building was converted to apartments in 2017. And this brought 580 homes to a central location with fantastic access to transit and opportunities. 180 Water Street was only able to convert because the Financial District has the most flexible conversion rules. Had this vacant office building been located anywhere else in the city, even Midtown Manhattan, it would not have been able to convert. Similarly, if it had been built just 7 years later, it would have been forced to remain an underused commercial space. If we fix these outdated and arbitrary rules, we can apply a consistent zoning framework to the entire city, enabling more homes for New Yorkers in every neighborhood. Next slide, please. So changes that we walk through tonight are just some of the initiatives proposed as part of City of Yes for housing opportunity. Overall, this text amendment aims to create a little more housing everywhere so that each neighborhood does its part to address our housing needs. And a few neighborhoods don't have to feel the intense pressure that they do today. It's not just about more housing, though. It's also about more types of housing. Multifamily housing, where it's currently not allowed because of exclusionary zoning, units of different sizes to meet different people's needs, and crucially, far more affordable and supportive housing. Next slide, please. So I want to thank everyone tonight so much for joining us for our second of these monthly info sessions. We look forward to your questions and comments and hope you might return for upcoming info sessions about the other elements of the proposal. And you can find more information about these info sessions as well as other ways to stay involved on our website, nyc.gov/yes-housing-opportunity. I'll turn it back to Jasmine.
Thank you, Winnie. And thank you everybody again for your patience while we had technical difficulties earlier. So now we're going to turn to the Q&A portion of tonight. So just some background information for the Q&A. We're going to start off tonight with a couple of the questions that we got through the Q&A feature. Then we'll switch over to some live questions. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. And then we'll kind of switch back and forth. We do want to make sure we get to everyone's questions tonight. So if you have or want to discuss further any questions that you have, you're more than welcome to email us, and we'll definitely can set up some time to talk further about anything that you still have questions on. But for now, we'll start off with some written questions. So just going from the top, will this presentation be sent out after the meeting? We are going to post the presentation and the slides, a recording of this meeting and the slides up at our website. So I know Veronica put in a bunch of links, but also putting the link to our website. If you scroll down now, you can see the recording and the slides from the info session we did last month. So similarly, this should be up this week, and you'll have access to the slides and the recording. So then next question, will you allow a basement and an attic and a garage on the same property to be converted into ADUs? If I can pass that to the housing team.
Great, thanks for that question. So one ADU will be allowed per 1 or 2 family building. So if you have a 1 or 2 family building, that building could only add one of those typologies. So maybe they'll choose to convert their garage, maybe they'll choose to add an attic or basement, depending on the structure of the building, but they will have to make the choice of one ADU that works best for their building typology.
Awesome, thank you, Veronica. Similarly, want to add another ADU question. Will the city provide pre-approved plans for ADUs and or the ability for architects and design firms to advertise their ADU design services? And additionally, will garage conversions need to maintain the parking spaces currently located on the property? And lastly, this was a 3-part one, so sorry. Will 2-story ADUs in the floodplains need to be raised to the same degree as new construction? If so, can they be taller than the primary dwelling?
So the city has convened an interagency working group that's focused on ADUs specifically, and we have discussed the idea of pre-approved plans for ADUs. That's somewhere that we've seen in other cities a lot of success and excitement about. So that is something that we're actively exploring. They haven't come to any decisions about that yet. About garage conversions and the preservation of existing parking, a 1 or a 2 family building will be allowed to remove their existing parking for the purposes of adding new housing, including an ADU. Then your final question is about ADUs in the coastal floodplain, conforming with existing floodplain regulations. So ADUs will have to comply with existing floodplain regulations. They will have a height limit of 2 stories. So you could do the, you know, locate your floor area on the second story of the building. If anyone has anything to add to that, feel free.
Great, thank you so much, Veronica. And then just a reminder, anyone can feel free to use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the bar. Great, we have some, we'll switch to live questions. We'll take a couple of live questions and then we'll switch back to the written Q&A to make sure that we're getting all the questions answered tonight. So starting off with Britt Bird, you're gonna get a notification to come on, and then you can unmute and ask your question. And Britt, I think you're able to come off mute now.
Okay, yeah, hi.
Great.
Hi, I'm Britt Bird. I'm a senior planner for Borough President Reynoso's office. I was wondering, I have a question about the map for the dwelling unit factor map. I was wondering what the criteria for those zones was, because it looks like they follow transit lines, but I noticed that Bay Ridge wasn't included, for example, but there's a transit line near there. So I was wondering if we could get more info on what is driving the decisions in those maps, both the dwelling unit factor ones and the ADU maps.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I can speak briefly about the map for the dwelling unit factor. So the transit zone is what the geography that's being referred to there, and that's based on what was created for the back in the day for zoning for quality and affordability. So it's an area that reflects neighborhoods that have good access to transit. So for and within the transit zone, we'd be eliminating the dwelling unit factor is what the proposal is to help facilitate our small and shared units proposal.
Okay, thanks. So the transit zone, even with the proposal to remove parking requirements across the city, the transit zone here would remain to inform the dwelling unit factor. It would still be part of the zoning resolution.
Yeah, so the transit zone will still be in the zoning resolution and will be, as you'll hear about in our March info session about the missing middle housing proposal. DCP is also creating a new transit geography that we're looking at to inform our missing middle housing proposals. So there'll be an update as well to the transit geography, and it'll be referred to as our transit-oriented development area.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Britt. Okay, moving on, we'll go to Giselle Santana next, and then followed by Eugene Fallick. Giselle, you'll be promoted in a moment, and then you can unmute.
Hi, good evening. How's everyone doing? Okay, so my question is kind of like a follow-up from the first presentation you guys had. So I do know that you guys were talking about like affordability and I think kind of like income averaging or something of the sort. So and I know it was mentioned that you guys are still working on HPD to calculate those numbers. So my question is, has it been brought to the table to kind of have what a rent calculator depending on people's income? Because can that be used as a factor? Because I feel like when you stick to like certain numbers, people kind of fall to like the cracks. Like you have all different types of different families, diverse families, whether it's single parent home or this like or even a family of four and they don't make as much money. So I just kind of just wanted to just put that out there.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Giselle. Yeah, go for it, Winnie.
Yeah, thanks so much, Giselle, and I appreciate you calling in while you're in transit, it seems. So just to reference the proposal that Giselle was talking about for folks who may not.
I'm parked up, my apologies.
Okay, gotcha. I'm glad you're safe. For the proposal that Giselle is referring to for folks who might not have been able to join our previous info session, it's the Universal Affordability Preference, or UAP, which is an updated zoning framework we're doing for our medium and high density parts of our city, so R6 to R10. And essentially this will allow for bigger buildings for projects that have affordable or supportive housing. And what affordability means for UAP for what we have now. As Jasmine mentioned, we are still early on in our proposal development stages and working with our partners at Housing Preservation Development, HPD, to work out the exact details for what exact income limits will be hitting with UAP. But we, as Giselle mentioned, we will be doing income averaging for the UAP. So this will allow for UAP developments to serve a broader range of New Yorkers. Essentially, depending on whatever AMI level we settle on for UAP, developments can target lower income households, deeper affordability, like those 30% AMI households, and average out with higher income households to ultimately reach that number. And we think this will help reach the New Yorkers that most need that type of housing in a way that makes the most sense of our current zoning, but also more broadly speaking for the proposals that we've talked about tonight. For example, for ADUs, we think that will help serve households that otherwise can't, like right now for our low density neighborhoods, the only type of housing that oftentimes is feasible under our zoning is a single family home. And that's arguably the least affordable housing type available on the market. So we think by allowing for ADUs that can create more affordable housing options, as well as for small and shared units. Of course, we think that will provide more affordable housing options, particularly for folks who are in more transitional periods of their life. So we think by creating avenues for these different types of housing types, we can target a wider range of New Yorkers that aren't currently being served by our housing market that's been constrained due to our restrictive zoning.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, because I've been following this for a while. I just done like my own research, and I just noticed that like a lot of people are just falling through the cracks, and it's like AMI this, AMI that, and then you have these developments coming to communities that they don't that they're building developments for above the AMI. So like I'm in community board 3, so our AMI is 65,000, and whatever developments we've had over here, they're not for people that are within that income range. So I just really hope that that working people, because if you make too low, you qualify for certain assistance, but if you make too much, or if you make more than enough, you don't qualify, but then you're also left out because you're not making enough for a market rent. So I'm really hoping that this is a good solution, because a lot of people have been falling within the cracks. And then another thing too, if it would be interesting for you guys to be able to get is numbers from DHS, working families that are in shelters, their incomes, and kind of just use that also as a way to gauge on policy or whatever that's created. Thank you.
Thank you, Giselle. We agree completely. I'm John Mangian, by the way, also from Housing Division with Veronica and Winnie. We have definitely seen many families fall through the cracks in terms of affordable housing availability in the city. And that's why we're extremely excited with UAP to move from inclusionary programs that hit only 80% AMI to ones that can hit a broad range of incomes. I hear you on the metric too. I know AMI is area median income is confusing and complicated for a lot of people. It's also, a metric that enables different affordable housing programs to talk to each other within an existing building. So, it comes from the federal government and is an important way to, finance affordable buildings. So we probably maintain that. But regardless of metric, we agree completely that the goal is to hit incomes, the lowest incomes possible, and to hit a broad range of incomes. And so I think we're in total agreement there.
Thank you, Giselle. Okay, so next, if we can promote Eugene Fallick. Afterwards, we'll do a couple of written questions, and then we have Dan, Jake, and Olive next in queue.
Hello.
Hi, good evening.
I live in Community Board 14 in Queens. And our board has taken a position virtually 100% opposed to the city of No. Let me raise a couple of issues. I hope you won't cut me off on this. First of all, there's a philosophy, I believe, that the population of the city should be essentially unlimited. If you believe that, and I don't know that most people in the city do believe it, perhaps you should build 100-story apartment houses all over. I'm sure you guys would say, well, no, that's not really what we intend. But for example, in Rockaway, in downtown Rockaway, where the highest buildings were 7 stories and where most housing within a half mile of downtown Far Rockaway consisted of 1 and 2 family houses, you guys approved 14-story buildings with very limited parking. And so on days, just for example, when at the Redfern housing projects, where there's alternate side parking, people walk over a mile to park in Bayswater. So what I'm suggesting is perhaps that you people don't live in the real world. Now, as I understand it, 25% of New York City housing is 1 or 2 family housing, which is the lowest percentage of any major city in the country. You guys are welcome to correct me if I'm wrong on that. And 10 or 15% is 1 family. Now, there are clearly people who are living in those houses who want to live in that type of neighborhood and don't want to live in a neighborhood of concrete boxes. And you guys, as I read the rules, are looking to convert the entire city to neighborhoods of concrete boxes with up to 8 stores on each corner. Now, first of all, do you think I'm being unfair in describing the city of No in that way?
Eugene, I would say that's not an accurate description of the proposals for lower density areas.
First of all, people who are listening should know that while I'm not finished, clearly, you're selectively muting me, which clearly you can do. But I don't think that that's a legitimate way to carry on this discussion. And that's just for the record. I also don't think it's legitimate that you guys have disabled chat so that the people who are present can't communicate with each other and provide alternative websites. Do you think I'm being unfair in saying that?
Hi, Eugene.
Oh,
go ahead, Jasmine.
I'm sorry, John. Yeah, thank you for raising some of those things, Eugene. I think we're more than happy to keep discussing anything related to the proposals. If you have a question, we're more than happy to answer a question.
Well, I think I've highlighted a number of issues that I think you guys can and should discuss. And I should tell you one other thing. I don't know how familiar you are with downtown Far Rockaway or the Peninsula Hospital site. When the Bayswater Civic Association commented on the ULURP and raised a number of issues, none of the issues were addressed by city planning. You merely said noted. For example, I'm going to use one example. Sam Schwartz, who used to be the city transportation commissioner, was the traffic engineer for one of the projects. And he said that even if DOT did everything that he recommended, the project would seriously adversely affect traffic from the New York City line to Beach 116th Street. Now, that's a pretty severe problem, considering that DOT has already made some trips take 2 to 3 times as long. So I really don't understand your philosophy. First of all, that I presume, and I'm just guessing, that you have some idea of what you believe the population of New York City ought to be, number one. Is that correct?
No, I mean, can we answer your questions now, Eugene? We're
Sure.
looking forward to. Okay. So going back to the top. So the overall purpose of the proposal, these zoning changes, is to enable a little more housing in every type of neighborhood across the city, from the lowest density to the highest density. And if we take a really wide geographic scope, we believe we can create a lot of additional housing without changing the character of any particular neighborhoods, including the low density ones. Now, I consider Queens Community Board 14 to be a neighborhood that a part of the city that has seen a disproportionate amount of development under the status quo in recent decades. So, you know, perhaps we're in agreement on that, that under the status quo, you know, you seem to think that there's been, you know, an extraordinary amount of development in Community Board 14. Part of the purpose behind enabling a little more housing everywhere is to take some of the pressure off of neighborhoods, you know, and community boards like Queens Community Board 14, like neighborhoods in central Brooklyn, like parts of the Bronx, that have seen a disproportionate amount of development pressure because those are, you know, among the few places in the city where a lot of development can still happen. So it's,
Well,
you know,
can I
development
interrupt you one moment?
development gets. I would love to be able to answer your questions first. So what happens, Eugene, is that development gets pushed to parts of the city where it can still happen by parts of the city where development can't happen. That's kind of the way that the status quo works these days. And so by taking that broad geographic scope, by enabling a little more housing in every neighborhood, we actually, this proposal is for parts of the city like yours. You know, we pay a lot of attention to Far Rockaway. I don't know if you've seen the book Between Ocean and City about the history and evolution of Far Rockaway, but you know, it's on our minds, let's say. And so when we get comments from, you know, folks in Community Board 14, or we hear from folks in PLG or East Flatbush a lot, or Bed-Stuy, Bedford Park, you know, different parts of the city that have experienced an extraordinary amount of like gentrification and displacement or development pressure, we can honestly say this proposal is for you. We completely recognize that not everybody in New York City wants to live in concrete boxes. That's why another animating principle of this entire enterprise is not just creating as much housing as we can. You know, creating a lot of housing is important, but we are also aiming to create a wider variety of housing types and housing typologies so that we have options for, you know, say smaller households that don't want to live in concrete boxes, that want to be able to age in place in the low density neighborhood where they grew up, or, you know, younger folks who are graduating from college or whatever and want to be able to find a place in the low density neighborhood in New York City where they grew up. And that's where things like ADUs come in, and, you know, some of the missing middle proposals that we'll talk about next week or next month. We absolutely are not trying to jam everybody into a single housing type. These are called housing opportunity proposals for a reason, because we want people to have housing opportunity. We want people to have housing choice. If you live in Far Rockaway, and, you know, say, you know, you're a young professional or something like that, and you want to live closer to job centers, we would like you to be able to do that if you want to. If you want to live in lower density New York, we'd like to create opportunities for you to do that as well. It's all about housing opportunity. It's all about housing choice. You know, these proposals emerge out of our fair housing report, and, you know, that is our lodestar: housing opportunity and housing choice. You know, and when it comes to neighborhoods like downtown Far Rockaway, or it comes to proposals like Peninsula Hospital site, you know, we're really proud of those. We worked with HPD, we worked with the community to you know, create hundreds and thousands of affordable housing units in those parts of the city. You know, those are occupied now. You have affordable housing in downtown Far Rockaway that families live in now. It's safe,
Not
it's
true.
sanitary, it's new construction, and you know,
In fact, some of it's being converted for
we're really
migrants.
proud of that. We're really proud of that. And so, you know,
Yeah.
again, back to the first principles, a little more everywhere. It really is a proposal that's for the Far Rockaways of the world, the Queens Community Board 14s that feel like, they have experienced disproportionate amounts of pressure under the status quo. And so we hope that you will understand that and come around and, support us eventually. Thanks.
If you think that we've been disproportionately affected, why did you approve this housing? Increasing the population from Far Rockaway area from 50,000 to 75,000.
There certainly is a need.
That?
There certainly is a need for affordable housing in neighborhoods across the city. And, when there's an opportunity to provide, again, affordable homes for families who, need places to live, that's why we do what we do.
We've got tons, well, not tons, we've got a significant percentage of Rockaway is occupied by NYCHA housing. And look, my grandparents lived in the Hamels houses. I understand the need for it. But, and I hope someone's not offended by this, I don't think God came down and said that it all needs to be in Rockaway, or that the population of the city needs to be 10 or 15,000. And sure, if you build it, they will come, because New York City is probably the most desirable area in the country to live in. There's no doubt about that. But the question is, what should the population be? And if you believe that you should provide all the housing that people want, why shouldn't you provide all of the other services that people want, like safe roads? DOT is working to make it impossible and dangerous to drive in the city. They murdered somebody out here in Rockaway a year ago. I don't want to get into DOT, but what I'm saying is, I think the first question needs to be, what should the population be? And then what reasonable way should you meet it that is acceptable in a civilized democracy to the population?
Thank you, Eugene.
Thank you so much, Eugene.
We do hear
Actually,
that.
John,
We do that.
John, I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I don't mean to interrupt you. I just want to make sure that everyone has enough time for their questions. We have a lot of people who have their hands raised and other Q&A.
Right,
So
I'll
I just
drop
want to
it.
make sure everyone has enough time. Just want to make sure it's fair for everybody. So thank you both. Thank you, Eugene, for joining us. I also want to encourage that we have our email. I know CB14 is definitely very involved in this process. So definitely want to encourage you to email us, and we can continue having a conversation on this. So thank you both very much. We'll move on to the next question. We're gonna go to written questions now, and then I'll come back to another set of 3 live questions. So the next written question is, what is the physical difference between shared housing and having roommates in a multi-bedroom apartment?
Great, thanks for this question. So the difference comes down to sharing a common household. In a roommate situation in a multi-bedroom apartment, you wouldn't necessarily have like private locks on your doors, and you have to share a common spaces with your roommates. In a shared housing situation, you could share certain unit amenities without having access to every part of the unit.
Awesome, thank you, Winnie. The next written question, how much new housing is going to be created by the conversion of commercial Manhattan real estate into residential? And why wouldn't that be enough new housing in the already high density zones of New York City while preserving the low density character of historically low density neighborhoods?
Great question. So when the Office Conversion Task Force took a look at this last year, which was interagency, practitioners, city agencies, etc., they estimated that enabling more conversions in the existing geography, Lower Manhattan, parts of Brooklyn and Queens, near the East River, a few other places, could result in about 20,000 office conversions. If we expand the geography citywide, we could expect somewhere around that number, 20,000. We're in the midst of environmental review right now that will put a number to that. On the other hand, the estimates of the amount of housing that we would need in order to catch up with, the folks who already live in New York City, but who don't have enough housing, leading to things like high housing costs, overcrowding, homelessness, gentrification, and displacement pressure, is on the order of 500,000 units. So we're excited to have something like our conversions proposals play a role, but it's just one among a fuller range of approaches that we hope can enable a little more housing in neighborhoods all across the city, to help take some of the pressure off the housing market that we see today.
Great. Thank you, John. And then last question before we go back to live questions, was just one of the last slides referred to allowing multifamily housing in areas now zoned for just single family. Would this override all single family zoning?
Thanks for this question. So single family districts will continue to exist under this proposal, but central to the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity is the idea that every neighborhood needs to contribute to meeting New York's urgent housing needs. And that includes parts of the city that have single family zoning. So as we've talked about tonight, ADUs will be allowed in single family districts in addition to a single family home, and that will help us meet the needs of a broader range of households, as well as extend additional flexibility to homeowners. As we'll talk about next month in March, there's also a few single family districts that are near transit or that they have commercial overlays over that single family district, and sites in those areas will be eligible for our middle housing initiatives so that multifamily development can be introduced at appropriate and limited locations.
Awesome. Thank you, Veronica. So I'm going to turn back to the live Q&A. I just want to thank everyone for their patience throughout tonight. We want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to answer their question. And then also want to encourage our email address in case if you have more questions, we're more than happy to send as much information as we can through email as well. So if we can promote Dan Curtin, and then after that, it'll be Olive, Freud, followed by Ben Waltzer.
Good evening, and thank you for having this, and for your brevity as well. My question is dealing with basement ADUs. So you were talking about how the Adams administration is doing what they can to open up basement ADUs. So they're going to revise administrative policy, and I do know that Governor Hochul is opening up and legalizing paths to basement apartments being opened up. But can you please go into detail, or at least talk about the laws that are the local laws that are restraining or constraining basement ADUs from being developed?
Sure. Like Veronica mentioned, we've convened an interagency task force to look at the full range of laws and regulations that get in the way of ADUs today. And I'd say first and foremost is zoning. If you have a single family district or a two family district, you just can't add a unit, to a one family home and a one family district, or a two family home and a two family district. Zoning strictly doesn't allow it. Beyond that, if you were able to add, a small home to your site today, it would have an off-street parking requirement with it as well. Our research in New York City and elsewhere shows that if you're talking about like a small home, 800 square feet or less, those folks tend not to own cars at all. And so, this parking requirement was just kind of strictly getting in the way of being able to, add a home onto zoning lots like that. And then there were other regulations, whether it's yards or perimeter height or, what have you, in the zoning that get in the way of being able to create workable ADUs in New York City. But there are also housing maintenance code issues. There are building code issues that we're working through with our interagency task force. There remain some state law issues that get in the way of legalization. Things in the multiple dwelling law, like floor to ceiling heights. We did a pilot program with HPD and some community organizations, and found that legalization without some tweaks and changes to the law is very, very difficult for most existing informal units. So we're hopeful, you're correct, that Governor Hochul has proposed pathways to legalization for some of those existing units. That hasn't passed yet, You know, it still has to go through the state legislative process. We hope we'll get that assist. If we don't get that at the state level, then we will do what we can to enable a workable prospective ADU program and do what we can, although it's limited without state help, to legalize existing informal units, because it really is a pressing health and safety issue. We need to know where these units are in order to, you know, avoid some of the situations that we saw during Ida, which was really tragic. So we're doing what we can.
Understood and much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. Next, if we can promote Olive Freud. Olive, you should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Can you see me now?
We can hear you.
All
Can't
right.
see you though.
Yeah, I want to go back to basics. We live in a very, very dense city. And the very first problem, the very first question you should be asking is, are you increasing the density? Eugene, your first person who spoke about this. Of course, New York is very desirable. Everybody wants to live here, but it just can't happen. And your design, the way to get to this problem is to say that there are other places in the world. There's suburbs, there's other little cities, and you can't keep adding density here. That's just, you're ruining what it is for those of us who live here. I can go piece by piece, but how you can, with what the streets are like, what the traffic is like. But I don't even really have to tell you. If you live here in New York, you know it's too dense. And all of your suggestions and all of your thoughts are basically making it more dense. And that's not the approach. That's not the best approach for seeing what this area has to be in the future. All right, that's really what I wanted to say. And I thought your first speaker, he did a very good job about it, but I think that what I'm saying is what is it, the 8 million of us who live in New York are saying, no, there's just too much going on here. We have to find a different way of living.
Thanks, Olive. We appreciate your question and your concerns. And I'd say we do hear that a fair bit. Like, why try to build more housing? Shouldn't we just kind of shut the gates and stop more people from coming as a way to address the issues that people face in neighborhoods around the city? And I'd say the most basic reason why we don't attempt an approach like that, I mean, it would be, I think, largely impossible to try to, you know, keep people from coming to New York, as you both pointed out. It's, you know, one of the, it's a real source of opportunity for people from around the country, from around the world. The basic reason why we don't do that is because, you know, it would be the worst possible thing that you could do for lower income people who try to make New York City home. If we were to try to somehow cap the amount of housing here as more and more people attempted to come, you know, that would supercharge all of the issues that Veronica and Winnie talked about that emerge from our existing housing shortage. It would send housing costs through the roof, as, you know, everybody competed for a limited amount of housing. It would lead many people to live in informal arrangements, whether that's overcrowded apartments or even on the street, increases homelessness. It would, you know, supercharge gentrification and displacement in parts of the city that are experiencing that today, in a way that would be, you know, immiserating for all but the wealthiest folks in this city, and even for them too. I mean, nobody would want to see what would happen to the city in the event that we tried to do something like that. And that's why, we're forwarding a set of proposals that we believe can create, the most significant amount of housing, of any set of zoning proposals in New York City history. But by taking a really wide geographic lens, we can do that without changing the character of any particular, neighborhoods. We know that there are a lot of concerns about lower density neighborhoods or, historic areas or things like that. And we think this approach is just the best possible approach in order to balance that need for new housing with the concerns that we hear from people in the neighborhoods that they love all across the city.
Thank you, Olive. Next up, we have Ben Walzer. If you can promote Ben.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So I wanted to ask a question about the universal affordability preference, specifically how it will line up with existing city programs that allow for a more height or density or floor area in residential districts when buildings contain affordable housing. But I also did just want to very quickly say that I do not believe that the city planning department should be setting a cap on the population of New York City. New York has, for its entire history, been a haven for immigrants and working people and LGBT people from all over the world. And the idea that you guys would try and regulate that away and close the door on it is, to me, frankly, un-American and a despicable notion. But can you talk about the UAP, please?
Thanks for your question, Ben. So for the universal affordability preference, I think you might be referencing a mandatory inclusionary housing or MIH. So for that, it would be MIH areas would still exist under the UAP framework. Essentially, if a development was in an MIH mapped area and wanted to take advantage of UAP, they could have access to higher FARs, but would have to maintain the same affordability set aside requirements that the MIH option, depending on what the project is, option 1 or option 2, would have for that project. So higher FARs, but the same affordability set aside requirements for MIH.
And as for the voluntary programs, the voluntary inclusionary housing programs that provide a bonus or a little additional height for developments that provide affordable housing, they've been around about 20 years. They've produced a few thousand units. But like we mentioned, all the units they create are right at 80% AMI, area median income. I think many of us on this Zoom know what AMIs have done in recent years, which has gone up and up and up, such that 80%, which is ostensibly the low income limit, is a lot higher than we want to see. So we propose to replace the voluntary inclusionary housing programs with UAP that will provide, additional FAR for buildings that provide, permanently affordable housing. We believe we can hit significantly better AMIs than the existing 80%. And we can also enable income averaging so that the affordable homes created hit a much broader range of incomes, including, down into the extremely low income range. And so we're very proud to make that change. But we are inspired by the voluntary inclusionary housing programs of the past. And that's why we think of UAP as basically taking that inclusionary housing framework, which exists in like little bits in different parts of the city that have been rezoned over the last 20 years, and just expanding that inclusionary housing framework across all medium and high density districts. So everything is basically an exclusionary housing framework area now. By going broad geographically, we think UAP can create tens of thousands of affordable homes in the next decade or so, and not to mention beyond that, in a way that basically dwarfs the number of affordable homes created by all other IH programs in New York City since their inception in 1987. So thanks for the question. We have got a whole presentation on that. Veronica put a link in the chat if people missed that one but want to see it, that goes as deep as you want on UAP and the effects that we think it will have on housing production in the city. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we're gonna switch back to questions, and then again we'll switch to live questions in a moment. Somebody had asked if we can just confirm that the raise hand feature puts you in the queue, and I'm just confirming that as long as you click the raise hand feature, you are part of the queue. So right now we have a handful of people with their hands raised, about 7 people with their hands raised. So feel free to use the raised hand feature, and we should see the order that you raised your hand in. So going to the next written question, what's the rationale behind having a cutoff date of building construction after which conversions to residential is not allowed? Why not allow any buildings to convert?
Got it. Good question. We hear that one fairly frequently. So the way that the conversion regulations, also known as the adaptive reuse regulations, work is they provide a relaxed set of light and air standards that, an existing office building would not be able to meet, or, an old loft building would not be able to meet, or a vacant school or an old hospital or whatever. They provide a relaxed set of light and air standards that enables those non-residential buildings to convert to residential, even though those buildings could not comply with the stricter light and air standards that apply to newly constructed residential units. If we had no cutoff date at all, then the conversion regs would just swallow the residential light and air regs. They might as well not exist anymore. And you could see, people doing things like getting permits to build, an office or a loft building or whatever, and then just immediately converting it to residential in a way that would frustrate the purposes of those light and air regs for new construction, which we think can appropriately be a little bit higher than the relaxed set of regs to enable adaptive reuse of vacant and underutilized non-residential buildings. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, John. For the next question, if you can just discuss the implications for historic districts, especially those which are mostly residential.
Well, we are looking to enable a little more housing in every neighborhood across the city. And, we hope that that would include historic districts. That said, we're not changing the way that historic districts work. Today, if you want to build something in a historic district, you got to go to LPC, Landmark Preservation Commission, to get approval to make sure that it fits in with the character of the area. That's not in zoning, that's a local law. And we can't change it, and we're not proposing to change it, so that will still apply. That said, in providing additional flexibility across the range of neighborhood types, we hope that, sites within historic district might be moved to try to build something there, to go to LPC and see if they can get approval, such that we see a little more housing production within historic districts, just as we hope for and expect in other types of neighborhoods across the city.
Great, thank you, John. And also just want to acknowledge that we actually got a couple of questions related to historic districts. So I'm hoping that that answered a couple of those questions just about the implications with residential. What about, those one family historic districts, and just in general, like how that's going to relate with City of Yes, but long story short, it won't. Okay, last question, and then we'll move on to live Q&A. Are ADUs income limited like typical HPD affordable housing, or can they also be market rate?
So ADUs will not have requirements to be income restricted. This is because we think mandating affordability in our ADUs would be extremely difficult to administer, and it would ultimately prevent the creation of new ADUs. We do think that ADUs will be naturally more affordable, firstly because of their small size. Evidence from previous cities also suggests that many ADUs many ADU owners rent out their ADUs for below market rate. They might, rent it out to a family member, for example. And in our outreach, we've also heard interest in renting out ADUs to voucher tenants, which I mentioned in the presentation. HPD is also exploring some programs that offer assistance to homeowners that are adding an ADU and require affordability as a condition of participation. So, for example, the +1 pilot program.
Awesome, thank you, Veronica. So we're going to switch back to the live questions. So for the first person, if you can promote Robert Press, then followed by Hazel Martinez, and then Maria Caruso.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm in Community Board 11. We have 1,000 units of new housing going up in part of our board that has not been on the scope. It's recently coming online this year and next year. We also have 2 Metro North stations that had 0 housing in 2018. Now, in 2022, Mayor Adams said he wants 6,000 units of housing built at the 2 stations, and city planning has upped it to 7,500 units. And from what I understand, that is not included in the city of Yes. Now, how much housing will the city of Yes, in addition to all of these new houses, that 8,500 units, be put on Community Board 11? And how many ADUs? What is the minimum amount per community board, and what is the maximum amount per community board?
Thank you very much for your question, Robert. You're referring to the Bronx Metro North Neighborhood Study, which is a neighborhood planning effort by city planning around a set of proposed new Metro North transit stations to come online in the decades ahead. And I think that's a great opportunity to compare and contrast between, the nature of a neighborhood study. We have a couple in process now. There's Bronx Metro North. There's another study going on in Jamaica as we speak as well. City of Yes does not, obviate neighborhood planning efforts in specific parts of the city. For neighborhood planning, people do a long-term, site-by-site, deep dive with all the stakeholders in a given area. And so often the types of changes that can emerge from a neighborhood study, again, because it's long and it's site by site and all the stakeholders are involved in a really concentrated fashion, the types of changes that can emerge from that can be more significant than anything we're proposing in any one area through the City of Yes. City of Yes is kind of complementary. Instead of, relatively big changes within a narrow geography, this is really smaller incremental changes across the widest possible geography. And those things, we think, really complement each other. Both are ways to get, significant amounts of new housing, with the full participation of the range of stakeholders.
However, you're talking about a suburban type of community in the East Bronx, which is basically 1 and 2 family homes in general. R3, R4 at most. The commercial districts are just strip malls, basically. And we heard a presentation last night that Montefiore Hospital is going to have a 215-foot building, as well as other buildings that, for instance, a 1-story Starbucks is going to be replaced by a 14-story building, and other buildings along Eastchester Road on the other side of Montefiore Hospital are going to be up to 20 stories. The road itself cannot handle it as it is. The police have to go around. There's a precinct over there also. There is a bike lane coming that will cut down the road. Plus, there is no parking proposed in these new buildings because of city planning. They want to eliminate, as you in the City of Yes, eliminate the parking requirement. So these buildings will be built after the City of Yes goes through and won't require any parking. And there'll be no parking by the train stations either. Whereas on the west side of the Bronx in Riverdale, you have 2 Metro North stations that have plenty of parking. And Governor Hochul in Harrison, only 3 stops up the line from where these stations are, had 148 units of housing, affordable housing built in Harrison with 150 parking spots, a mall, which we're supposed to get, but that mall has 500 parking spots, and there'll be 175 parking spots for the Metro North station. Why is it that the East Bronx is getting shortchanged and being forced to take these taller buildings without parking?
Okay. Thank you very much, Robert, for your questions. I'll try to take them in turn. As far as the single family areas in the Eastern Bronx, primarily the changes that would affect that are not to, enable massive new buildings in those areas at all. We're not changing the zoning designation of any existing zoning districts at all. Would be to enable, you asked about ADUs, enable accessory dwelling units for homeowners who want to add them. Maybe they need more space for a multi-generational family. maybe they need a little extra income to cover expenses. What we've seen in other jurisdictions, the many other jurisdictions that have legalized ADUs, is that take up tends to be relatively limited. These are, ADUs can be life-changing for the homeowners who decide to add them, more space for family, a little more income, but they are not neighborhood changing in a broad, take up typically is in the single digits, the lower single digit percentage, which might mean 2 or 3 new ADUs on a block or something like that. In New York City, lots tend to be smaller, so it's a little more challenging. So we can't say for certain what the take up will be, but we're doing environmental review right now on that. So we think it's great for individual homeowners who want it, but we do not expect it to transform the character of neighborhoods. Right. As far as the Bronx Metro North study goes, those are going to be new transit stops. These are going to be like places where if you live near it, you can hop on it and be in Midtown in 20 minutes.
Only if you can afford it. The fare is $10 or more. I know that from being living in Riverdale.
I know that they're working on commuter fares for within the city. That's a MTA Metro North thing.
And however, though, the area around the Metro North stations is not a low-income area. It's a relatively middle-class or upper-middle-class area. So the people will not get any tax breaks. Or
but regardless of whether it's low income, whether it's high income or whatever, it generally makes good planning sense to add new housing right by a transit stop like that. And so that's what the neighborhood rezoning effort proposes to do. And that has not been enacted yet either. I mean, I assume that you are fully participating in that as well. And it's absolutely crucial to have a robust public process that ends up with an outcome that everybody can be happy with. As far as parking
I don't want to
goes,
take up any more time. Thank you.
Yeah, Robert.
Thank
just
you.
as far as your
sorry, John. Let me just also give Robert. We have a Bronx Metro North email that we can share with you as well. So I just want to share that with you. It's B as in boy, M as in Mary, N as in Nancy, and S as in Sam. So bms@planning.nyc.gov. The Bronx Metro North team is definitely more than happy to have these conversations with you. So please feel free to reach out so that we can have more conversations.
I'm on their mailing list because I'm a reporter also. So thank you.
Great.
Right.
Thank you
just
very much.
One little cleanup there, since you asked about parking. We are proposing to eliminate parking requirements for new housing going forward. That absolutely does not mean that no parking will ever be developed, especially in places
last night by city planning in the Bronx.
Especially in places like, Eastern Bronx or Eastern Queens or Staten Island or whatever. We fully expect, again, we've seen it within New York City and in other jurisdictions that have eliminated parking requirements. We fully expect new housing to provide parking in parts of the city that are more auto dependent. We recognize that exists. And, even today, we have developers in South Brooklyn or wherever providing more parking than required just because it makes the housing more marketable. So we're not going to prevent anybody from providing parking, and we fully expect that parking will still be provided in more auto-dependent parts of the city. So I just want to make that distinction. So thank you, Robert.
Thank you both. So next, if we can promote Hazel Martinez, and then that'll be followed by Maria Caruso. I'm so sorry. If I mispronounce your name, please correct me when you come on. And Hazel, you should be able to unmute.
Okay. Yes. Hello. Good evening.
Hi, good evening. We can hear you.
Oh, okay. I live in East Flatbush in Community Board 17. And the use of as of right has allowed our community to be decimated. It is filled with lots of little concrete buildings. It's actually no longer a community. And I think what you all are creating is a transient community where you have these very super tiny or alternate living arrangements, which people will not be living in long term. They will be moving out as soon as their situations change or they get families. And it'll not be a community with any cohesiveness at all. And the other issue that bothers me is the fact that all this housing you're talking about, not necessarily for people who have lower incomes. Well, I'm looking at all the of quote affordable housing. You have to make a minimum of 75,000. So where are the people who are going to clean these office buildings and pick up the garbage? The city itself doesn't pay people enough to acquire some of these apartments. So I want to know, what are we really doing here?
Yes, thank you so much for your question, Hazel. And definitely hear that. I think neighborhoods like East Flatbush, I think really represent the current issues with our existing restrictive zoning. So neighborhoods, for example, in like 2022, like 9 of our 59 community districts produced the same amount of housing as the remaining 50, which is absolutely crazy and represents how 9 of these neighborhoods have really borne the brunt of our housing production and really been supporting the housing growth for the city. And that's completely unfair and unequitable. So by updating our zoning and relaxing it a little bit to allow for more housing growth throughout the entire city so that every neighborhood can do its part to support our housing growth can help relieve some of the pressure on neighborhoods like East Flatbush, including other neighborhoods that have seen tremendous housing growth. So that's the main driving force behind the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity, is try to spread out that housing growth burden that's being borne disproportionately by particular neighborhoods. And then for the other things you touched about transient communities, we think for the proposals that we talked about tonight, for instance, for small and shared units, we think that could support folks who are in more transitional periods of their lives. In our stakeholder engagement process, we met with people who said that this would be really helpful to support folks who are young folks who are living in foster care and aging out and may otherwise be facing homelessness without small and shared units as a housing option. And we think by providing these housing options can serve these niche housing markets that otherwise may not be able to find any sort of living situation. But we think that once they get their feet under them and able to get a job and get settled, they can move into neighborhoods once they are able to afford those rents to live in different housing situations. And also for speaking about cohesiveness, I think like right now, folks are often taking up like family size units that would otherwise be able to go to like 2 or 3 bedroom apartments that could otherwise go to a family, and definitely support the family oriented neighborhoods that are right now being taken up by young folks who can't otherwise afford to live alone because of what we currently have available as our housing options in New York City. And then finally, I think you touched on also about like making sure we have enough housing for folks who work for the city. I mean, we all work for the city right here, and we definitely recognize how it's really unaffordable to live in parts of the city. Definitely, like I live with roommates to afford rent. So definitely like recognize that, for example, for the universal affordability preference or UAP proposal, again, that would target for a broader range of household incomes, to allow for income averaging so that we can serve those deeply affordable, produce those deeply affordable units, those 30% AMI units, for instance, area medium income, and reach a broader range of New Yorkers. Because we definitely recognize that the affordable housing that we're producing isn't able to serve as many New Yorkers that truly need that type of housing to be able to stay in the city. And what makes New York so great is that the folks who come here and work here and, have their family here. I lived in New York my whole life, definitely would not have the opportunities unless we had access to different types of housing options that were affordable for my family at the time. So I think definitely recognizing that UAP and well as unlocking different types of housing options within our lower density neighborhoods can help address the affordability crisis that we're currently facing.
Thank you, Winnie. So next we'll have Maria Caruso, and then we'll transition into some more Q&A questions. If you can promote Maria. Maria, I think great, we can hear you.
Oh,
Yes.
great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you for the presentation. I sit on the Housing and Zoning Committee of Community Board 10 in the Bronx, and also located in the Northeast Bronx. And we unanimously voted no to the City of Yes economic opportunity portion, and hopefully we're going to unanimously vote no for the housing portion. I think that we live in a beautiful, diverse city. I've lived here my whole life and lived in a lot of different neighborhoods, grew up in the projects in Soundview area of the Bronx. Now I live on City Island in the Bronx. Very different communities, and I think that's what makes us a unique city, is that we have these little pockets and different communities and different neighborhoods. And what I think that this housing City of Yes is doing is just throwing a big blanket on the entire city, all 5 boroughs, and trying to make a one-size-fits-all kind of situation. Now, I know that John mentioned about, that historical districts and historical areas and very low density areas are not going to have very much change to them, and the characteristics of the neighborhoods are going to remain the same. I don't believe that. I hope so, because I live in an area where we have special district zoning. So I don't see how there is going to be no change to my area if all of this goes through. We have an issue with parking. We have an issue with traffic. The gentleman that spoke from Community Board 11, which is the Eastchester Road, Pelham Parkway area. I work in that area, so I know during the day it's a nightmare to get through there. The traffic right now is impossible. You sit at a traffic light 4 and 5 times, it will change before you could even move. And it is surrounded by 1 and 2 family homes that already have parking issues, because people that are living in those homes have 2, 3 cars, and they park them all along the streets. And people that have one home with 1 car have to walk forever to just find a parking spot now. And this is only going to intensify and get worse as these programs kick in. So wanted to say that, and I wanted to ask, my questions were, you mentioned in the presentation about 180 Water Street, and what a big success that was in converting that from an office building into residential. So I wanted to know what the apartments cost in that building. What is the cost? And if just in case I'm not allowed or have time to ask another question, my other question was going to be about Mitchell-Lama co-ops that seem to have been successful throughout the city, and why not convert more units into Mitchell-Lama co-ops instead of, doing what you're doing now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. We appreciate hearing from you. So back to your comments, you mentioned that this seems one size fits all to you. I think that we have tried to create a range of proposals that work differently in different parts of the city, precisely to avoid, the type of homogenization that it sounds like that you're worried about. We're not trying to put high rises in every neighborhood or anything like that. We have a different sets of proposals for the lowest density areas, 1 and 2 family districts, for lower density multifamily districts, and for medium and high density districts as well, that again we think can enable a little more housing in neighborhoods across the city without drastically changing any neighborhood character in any one place. What we worry about, what could be homogenizing, the type of homogenization that we fear, is that if we don't build enough housing in New York City to moderate housing cost increases, to address the human costs of the housing shortage, like overcrowding, like homelessness, like displacement and gentrification pressures, you create parts of the city that only wealthy people can live in at all. Like, that's it. Like, if you are somebody who has chosen to be in a profession that is less remunerative, if you are disabled and don't have a ton of money to spend on housing, if you're a young person just starting out, if you're an old person, on a fixed income, like, you create neighborhoods that only rich people can live in. And that is a much more frightening and a much realer type of homogenization that we are afraid of, than the idea that New York City, that every neighborhood in New York City would like look and feel like every other neighborhood. We know New York is much stronger than that. And so that's why we have a range of proposals that work differently in different types of neighborhoods in order to, try to push back against what we see in neighborhoods that are gentrifying or experience significant displacement pressure. That's the type of homogenization we're afraid of. And so we have proposals like the conversion proposal. Those buildings already exist. They're underutilized. They're vacant. Why not turn them into something vibrant and useful like new housing? What about the town center proposal? This is in low density commercial districts. We see, lots of one-story taxpayers, often vacant in low density commercial districts. Why not re-legalize a form of housing that everybody knows and everybody loves? Like 2, 3, 4 stories of housing above a commercial ground floor. Like, I know not everybody wants to live in housing like that, but a lot of people do. So we want to bring it back and enable things like that will reinforce the character of our commercial districts. And so we think that the proposals work with, the New York we know and love, not against it. Many of our proposals look to the past and things that have worked in the past to try to build housing in the future. As far as 180 water goes, I don't know offhand what those units are renting for. I'm glad that housing exists as opposed to a vacant or underutilized office building. I can say that the city is very strongly advocating for a tax incentive at the state level that will enable conversions to have affordable housing. So in the future, say you have an office building or an old, vacant school or whatever that's converted to housing, that tax incentive would support the creation of affordable housing along with, the other types of housing in those developments, so that whenever a building converts, you would have housing for families at a range of incomes. We love the Mitchell-Lama program. Those funding streams no longer exist. It's not a program that's still operative, even though the buildings that were built under it are still here. We are trying to do whatever we can as well for Mitchell-Lama campuses or NYCHA campuses or other developments, with existing buildings to enable infill development on those sites to help to enable Mitchell-Lamas, some of which are in, financially precarious positions, to thrive into the future while also creating additional housing. And just because Mitchell-Lama no longer exists as a new construction program doesn't mean we can't do that through other programs as well. And so we're working very carefully with our friends at HPD and allies at the state and even federal level to, create new affordable home ownership along with the affordable multifamily rentals that we all know as well.
Thank you, John. So we'll move on to a couple of written questions and then we'll come back to raised hands. And then again, as a reminder, if you're using the phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand. So going back to our Q&A questions, will my property taxes go up if I build an ADU? Also, does DOB need to inspect and provide a CO, which is a certificate of occupancy for those who don't know?
So we are continuing to look into the effect of adding an ADU on property taxes with the relevant agencies like the Department of Finance. But in the end, the tax impacts are ultimately something that homeowners will have to weigh in their decision to add an ADU. Homeowners will be free to decide for themselves if ADUs make sense for their property based on how much revenue would be generated and how much the property taxes may increase, as well as a wide range of other factors. As for the second question, I mentioned earlier that we've convened this interagency working group that includes the Department of Buildings, who administers certificate of occupancies. So as part of that interagency working group working on ADUs, we will discuss the certificate of occupancy process, as well as other sort of enforcement mechanisms, which we've received some other questions about.
Great, thank you, Veronica. So next question. Is City of Yes going to create more 2 to 3 bedroom housing so families can stay in New York City and at rates that aren't mid to high 4-figure rent ranges?
Yes, we are looking to enable the full range of housing types, from supportive to small and shared to ADUs of 800 square feet or less, all the way up to 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, and more. We are saying yes to the full range of housing types across the board, and by enabling more development, we expect to get more of all of those types of housing. We are particularly focused, the affordable units that are created through zoning mechanisms today they have unit mix requirements. So, you can't do, say, a universal affordability preference building that has like all studios or one bedrooms or whatever. Today the inclusionary housing programs have bedroom mix requirements. We would maintain those as well to ensure that when we're creating, new affordable units, that they are available to a range of household and family sizes.
Great, thank you. And then one last question before we moved on to raised hands. What about, I guess just going back to some of the parking proposals. I know during the last info session, we talked a little bit about these parking proposals. So for anyone who's interested in getting that recap, you can visit our website and there you can learn more information about that. But if Winnie or Veronica, if you can give a quick recap to what we're doing with parking, that'd be really great.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine. So the parking proposal essentially is we're going to be making parking optional for new housing construction citywide. And the reason for that is building parking itself is quite costly. It adds to overall housing construction costs. In some incidences also contributes to an underproduction of housing. So for sometimes developers may underbuild a site in order to waive out of parking requirements because those parking spaces just wouldn't fit on the site. By making parking optional, we would be able to fully build out those sites and produce housing. And this again contributes to the incremental housing growth that the City of Yes of Housing Opportunity is about. It's about a little more housing in every neighborhood. So a few more sites can add 5 or 6 more apartments that it contributes to overall housing growth through the entire city. We also want to underscore, though, that parking will still be allowed, and we believe that developers will continue to provide parking, particularly in neighborhoods that residents have demand for parking spaces. And our transportation division has done some research into areas where parking already is optional and have found projects where developers are producing that parking because there is that need.
Great, thank you, Winnie. So going back to the live Q&A, we have 5 raised hands left. We're going to take these last 5 because we are starting to run short on time. We're hoping to wrap up by 8:30 so that everyone can have a great rest of your evening. And we'll also answer a few more Q&A questions. Before we all wrap up, we'll make sure to drop in our email address so that in case if we didn't get to your question, please feel free to email us. We'll make sure to get you a written answer. And if we need to schedule something to further discuss, we're more than happy to do that. So for the last 5 with their hands raised, we'll go with Jeffrey Harris first, followed by Nikki B. And Jeffrey, you should be able to unmute.
Oh, I can. All right.
Oh, perfect.
There we go. My first question is, will this be presented to all the community boards of the city?
You
This
betcha.
presentation?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Now, the second question, has anybody thought about the proposals that is being made? I mean, doesn't anybody realize that you're creating more housing, which a couple of people mentioned about the density of the communities, which is true. A lot of communities do not want development because it changes the characteristics of the neighborhood. And that's been brought up many a times. I'm on Community Board 11 in Brooklyn. And a lot of things that come up for new development has been knocked down because it changes the entire neighborhood. You mentioned, John mentioned about adding apartments above stores. That changes the characteristics of a neighborhood. People do not want that. They are comfortable where it is now. Does anybody take into effect of what happens to the surrounding areas? Is there enough sewage? Is there enough sanitation? Is there enough parking? Is there enough shopping for grocery stores and stuff like that? This is you're like off the top of your head. To me, it's not well thought. And what you're doing is you're creasing and you're just throwing people together. What about all the apartments that have not been rented? What about all the apartments that are being held from these money-hungry landlords that are on rent control and they don't want to release them? All right, that should be looked into.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I appreciate that. I'll try to handle your questions in reverse order. First off, I don't know if you saw the recent housing and vacancy survey the HPD puts out every 3 years. We are basically at the lowest levels of vacancy in New York City since 1968, since basically towards the beginning of when they started tracking such things. And that includes, NYCHA units, that includes rent stabilization units, despite what you might hear from some quarters. So there is just an absolutely, soul-crushing housing shortage out there right now that, again, has those real, actual, direct human costs that Veronica and Winnie mentioned, rising rents, overcrowding, homelessness, segregation, displacement, gentrification pressures, you name it. And so if we don't attempt to build additional housing, then we can expect all of those things to get worse as the pressure on New York City increases. We are in the midst of extremely large environmental review right now that looks at the impact of our proposals across a range of impact categories. You mentioned things like, water and sewer, also school seats, open space, traffic and congestion, things like that, that we will have to release before we can enter this proposal into public review. So, we're working with the full range of sister agencies to ensure that the infrastructure and other types of support necessary is in place in order to move these proposals through public review. We absolutely, everything I said about the consequences of the human housing shortage, totally true, but we are not doing this heedless of the effects for neighborhood character. We are not looking to eliminate single family districts. When it comes to things like town center proposal, like you mentioned, what we're really doing is, re-legalizing the type of buildings that are already in those commercial corridors. It's you walk down some of these corridors and there are 5-story buildings on either side of the street, 4 stories of housing above commercial ground floor, and you absolutely would not be able to build that today. These were all built in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. People like that type of housing, but it's illegal now. And so we are looking to the past and saying, why not re-legalize this type of housing that everybody likes, will enable a little more housing in a way that reinforces neighborhood character, that doesn't work against it. And I think a town center is like a metaphor kind of for what we're doing with all our proposals, trying to take a look, in many cases, backwards to New York City history, to the types of housing that works as we figure out ways to build more housing in the future, while, not dramatically changing neighborhood character across the full range of densities.
Okay, thank you, John. So like we mentioned, we're going to take so Jeffrey was first, and we'll take the next 4. So it'll be Nikki B, Laura Spalter, Hank Powell, and Nancy Walby. Just because we're starting to run short on time, we are trying to wrap up by 8:30 to make sure we all respect your time as well. So if you can promote Nikki B, and then we'll be followed by Laura Spalter. Okay, it looks like Nikki B declined twice, so we'll move on to Laura Spalter. And then Laura, you should be able to unmute.
Okay. Have I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I have a few questions. I'll try to be brief. What criteria was used to determine areas in the transit TOD areas? If you live in a low density neighborhood and you're in that map you showed for TOD, what can developers build as of right? That's my first question.
Sorry, do you want to ask all the questions, then we answer?
Okay. And then people have alluded to this about there's nothing about funding on infrastructure. When you're increasing density at this level, I do believe that there'll be even more than is now knocking down of lower density homes and lower buildings and bigger, denser buildings going up. The city is under a mandate to reduce combined sewer overflow. And whether it's a big building with reduced front yard, rear yard, side yard, taking off trees, or an ADU where you're in a backyard and you're removing trees, removing grass, this is going to reduce the ability for water to infiltrate. It will not be able to infiltrate because we'll be a city of cement. And as a result, there will be an increase in flooding and combined sewer overflow. This is a real environmental issue that I hope that you will be looking at. And when I put a comment in for the environmental review, I raised these kind of questions because that's what happens when you have increased density in cement. So, yeah. Have you thought about how City of Yes is going to work with the mandate to reduce combined sewer overflow and our flooding problem? And by the way, I live in an area that when we have a big rain event, raw sewage comes up into people's apartments, comes up through their toilets. And when I see City of Yes and more build, and not a word about infrastructure, sewer and water lines, I think that's scary.
No, we hear you completely, and I gotta say, you read our minds in terms of the environmental issues that we're taking a really close look at for the environmental review for City of Yes. Like I said, we're in the midst of the environmental review now. We have seen your comments. You're obviously well informed about these issues, and so we're working with an interagency group that includes, DEP, among other agencies, that tell us like it is when it comes to proposals that would add additional housing in different parts of the city. One of the things we do like about the fundamental approach here, a little more everywhere, is that we do not expect it to result in dramatic amounts of new housing in any one part of the city. Like a neighborhood study like Gowanus, added 8,000 new units within a relatively limited geography, and obviously entailed extensive capital improvements in order to make that feasible. By taking a really broad approach geographically, adding a little more everywhere, we hope that we will not have that type of overtaxed infrastructure that you're concerned about. That said, we are looking at these issues as part of environmental review. Veronica, I think you were going to answer the first question on the TOD area. If that's right, I'll kick it over to you.
Sure. Your first question is actually about a proposal that we're going to present about next month on March 27th. We'll present about our transit-oriented development proposal. But if there's any confusion about the relevant transit-oriented development geographies, I'll just clarify that now quickly. So we have an existing geography in the zoning, which is now known as the transit zone. When we showed a map today of where small and shared apartments will be allowed, where we'll be eliminating the dwelling unit factor, that's in the existing transit zone. That is an established geography. We will be renaming it the inner transit-oriented development area as part of this text amendment, but the geography is already established. As you'll hear about next month, we'll also be establishing a new geography that extends past the inner transit-oriented development area, called the outer transit-oriented development area, or together they're called the greater transit-oriented development area. And that's a geography that measures areas of the city within a half a mile of fixed rail, within subway or rail stops. Okay, I think we can move on to the next one now.
Great. Thank you very much, Veronica. So moving on, we have Hank Powell, if Hank can get promoted, and then we'll finish with Nancy Walby. Hank, you should be able to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
My question simply is, I live in the Ridgewood Historic District, We've seen parts of the area which are not within the district where there are the old-fashioned brick row houses and concrete and glass structures have appeared even at a higher roof line in the midst of them. In our area, these houses are built around 1907. They all have a common front and are listed to be the same. Having said that, it would seem a shame that they're going to be potentially changed. My question is very simple. How many or which sort of the restrictions on historic preservation are going to be lifted in this and other areas that are listed as historic preservation districts?
Thanks, Hank. That's a really good question. So historic districts, landmarking, things like that exist outside the zoning. Those are, controlled by LPC and our local laws. We are not proposing to change the way historic districts are administered by LPC. So just as today, let's say these proposals are enacted. If you wanted to do something within a historic district, you would have to take your proposal to LPC and show that it was appropriate. So we don't propose to alter that process at all. We're hopeful that historic districts won't be totally off limits to any new housing ever. We're hopeful that, like other parts of the city, that they can appropriately contribute to housing production. But that said, we are not looking to change the way that historic district protections work.
Great, thank you. And then finishing off with Nancy Wolby, and then we'll wrap up with a couple of the Q&A questions. Great, and Nancy, you should be able to unmute now.
Okay, thank you so much. This has been very interesting. My question has to do, and I think some of the previous speakers touched on it, but mine is, what part of the city of Yes addresses the changes to services and infrastructure that would be necessary, such as transportation, that was mentioned, but also sanitation, sewers, schools, the fire department, and the NYPD, to just name a few. I mean, so if you can answer that, that would be great.
Great, thank you. Yeah, very good and important set of questions. We are in the midst of a very wide-ranging, far-reaching environmental review right now that looks at the effects of the proposal citywide across the full range of 27 impact categories, including the ones that you mentioned. We will be able to identify any trouble spots in any of those impact categories. For instance, maybe there are parts of the city that are overcapacity school seats today, and these proposals would in some sense contribute to that in the future. We hope to identify those and then figure out with our sister agencies what to do with them. As I think you may be aware, this set of housing proposals is a huge priority for the administration. And so I think that makes it a real opportunity for neighborhoods across the city to use the process as a way to advocate for and get the types of improvements that can help get this proposal over the top. So stay tuned for our environmental review. We will have to publish that before we put it into put the proposals into official public review. And we are working with our sister agencies now, and we'll continue to work with them up to, and beyond enactment, to make sure that if these proposals, lead to the need for infrastructure improvements in certain parts of the city, that we can try to provide them as a city, not as city planning, but as a city.
Thank you. So that's all the live Q&A for now. We'll finish off with some of the Q&A questions. We want to be respectful of everyone's time, and we know it's 8:30 right now, so I didn't want to go too over. Also, just want to remind everyone, we have another info session next month, but you don't have to wait for that next info session. You can feel free to email us at any time. John and his team are really diligent with answering questions on that email, so we'll make sure to get you as much information as we can share through that email. And we also have a bunch of resources on our website as well. So going back to the Q&A, just closing out with this question of how will this ensure that the area that doesn't currently build any housing will contribute? So are there any requirements for local targets, or does this just change what's being permitted?
Thanks for this question. So your first question really gets to the heart of this text amendment, which is to allow for a little bit of housing in every neighborhood. In our current restrictive zoning framework, some neighborhoods have been able to opt out of addressing our urgent housing needs, and this has put additional pressure on a few neighborhoods to produce more and more housing. So we do think this will open up opportunities for housing in every neighborhood across the city. This legislation or this zoning text amendment in itself won't create new targets. The city council has passed a fair housing bill that relates to targets for different communities. And we appreciate the city council's commitment to fair housing. And we think that the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity is a way to put that commitment to fair housing into practice.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Veronica. So we're at time. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We really, really appreciate everyone being a part of this process. And we really want to emphasize that this is still a process. Like we mentioned earlier, the text and the proposal still hasn't been drafted or created. So the whole purpose of running these meetings is to have these open discussions. So we really appreciate everyone joining us and sharing all your experiences across New York City. So with that, have a great night, and we'll see everyone next month. Take care, everybody.